Okay folks, this is a 1998 Chrysler Town & Country minivan with a 3.8 liter 6-cylinder engine, which is a front-wheel drive car, and as most of you folks know, that is a transverse mounted engine, which means the engine is sideways in the engine compartment. And today I'm going to be showing how to access the fuel injectors, because this van has a bad fuel injector. The number one fuel injector, which unfortunately is in the back of the engine compartment, the most inaccessible place, is showing a OBD2 default or a fault code, onboard diagnostic 2 fault code. And so I've got to go in there and replace it, and hopefully that will fix the problem, which has displayed itself as a symptom of occasional rough idle or rough engine or an engine miss in the number one cylinder, which it's also showing a fault code for number one cylinder engine miss. Okay, I was mentioning an onboard diagnostic 2 computer system, which every car in the United States has had to have. It's a system that is common to all cars. It monitors the engine and feeds out information about whether the smog controls are working right, and most every other part of the engine, as far as the fuel injection, the cooling system, all the sensors, etc. And so there's a port that is inside the car. By law, I think it has to be within 3 feet of the driver, and it's got to be a common port that any OBD2 scanner can use. And so you can order these things over the internet, and this is an example of an OBD2 scanner, and it's a Bluetooth model, which means it can communicate wirelessly with something like a smartphone. And it's just a $20 item, and there are the connection wires that go into the port in the passenger compartment, typically underneath the steering wheel. So we'll take a look at that. There's the driver's side of the car, and underneath the steering wheel you'll see this port right there that just sticks down, and that's so that any mechanic can plug their diagnostic equipment into the OBD2 system, and the car will basically tell the mechanic whether it's operating correctly, and if not, what system is malfunctioning. And it spits out a series of codes that tell the mechanic or tell the OBD2 scanner what is not operating correctly. And so you can just plug this in there like that, and typically starts to light up, and if the ignition is turned to the on position, it will then communicate with a smartphone that has an app loaded onto it. In this case, my smartphone had an app called Torque loaded onto it that would read the fault codes from the scanner, and here it's showing 2 fault codes, a P0201, which is a fault with the number one cylinder injector circuit, and it's showing a fault code of P0301, which is a cylinder number one misfire, no doubt also related to that fuel injector, which is malfunctioning. Now that just kind of gets you in the ballpark and tells you something's wrong with the fuel injector, but not really exactly what it is. Could be the fuel injector itself is malfunctioning. Could be that the wiring to that number one fuel injector is faulty. It's got either an open circuit or a short circuit, or it could be that the PCM, or power control module, which controls all of the fuel injectors and sends out electrical impulses to tell the fuel injector to pulse on or off at different times in the stroke cycle, that PCM module could be bad. So anyway, I'm going to do what is the most obvious thing and replace that fuel injector to see if that will nip it in the bud. Otherwise, I've got to take it to a mechanic who has more advanced OBD2 scanner equipment to narrow down the problem if it is in fact wiring or PCM related. Okay, before we start on this project to access the fuel injectors and replace the number 1 cylinder fuel injector, I just wanted to go over some of the tools and materials that might be helpful to have assembled before you start a project like this. Panning over here, I've got one of those portable tables, collapsible tables. On it I've got an assortment of ratchets, extensions, wrenches, and sockets, a couple of screwdrivers, a pair of pliers, and something that I find very useful is this magnetic parts tray. It's got a magnet on the bottom so that it will stick to anything metal, so you could put it on the side of the car like that, or on your radiator support, and just put bolts in there as you disassemble them, and the bolt will stick right to the tray and will not fall out. And I find that's invaluable in keeping parts organized and not losing them into the deep recesses of the engine compartment if they fall suddenly or you brush up against them. So I really like this. It's got a magnet on the bottom and the tray on the top that will grab the nut. Going over here, I've got a bigger table that I'm going to use primarily to put disassembled parts on, like air cleaners and stuff like that. Over here we've got some shop towels, which are really necessary, and then we've got an assortment of lubricants. Your WD-40, which I'd use on any bolt that you're putting back into the engine, makes it easier to reassemble if they're rusted. Liquid wrench, which is a penetrant that you use to get off frozen bolts. So it's kind of the traditional thing. And something I just recently found out about is called PB Blaster, and that is performs the same job as liquid wrench, but it is much quicker. It works in like 5 minutes, as opposed to liquid wrench may have to sit on there for half an hour or hours or overnight to get a frozen bolt loose. Carburetor cleaner. I like a dunk tank like this that you can get dirty bolts that have got years of gunk on them. There's a little dunking device here that you can use to put the bolts in, let it soak for a while, and then pick it up and retrieve it, and get those bolts clean before you put them back into a threaded hole where they wouldn't work so well if they still had gunk on them. A mirror with a little extension on it is invaluable for getting at things that you can't really see, getting at a bolt that you can't really see because it's behind something. Flashlight, same thing. Inside an engine compartment it can be dark, and you might need to illuminate an area to figure out what's going on. A collection of hose clamps, and I mainly brought this out to show the distinction between a standard hose clamp, which you use to clamp something like a water hose or a vacuum hose or a transmission line, and distinguishing that with a high pressure fuel injection hose clamp. And this is the only type of hose clamp that you can use on a fuel injection supply line, which gets pressurized to at least it has a rating of about 100 psi. It might be pressurized to 50 or 60 psi, pounds per square inch, and it has to have a special type of clamp to work. And this is important because the fuel injection lines on a car like this, 18 years old, 175,000 miles, if you take out a fuel injection line because you're accessing the fuel injectors, it's probably going to be hardened and brittle after 18 years and 175,000 miles in that harsh environment of the engine compartment. And so that fuel injection line may develop cracks. It probably will have superficial cracks in it when you take it out, but it may develop an actual failure crack when you move it. Just from being moved a little bit when you take it out, it may fail. You won't know it's failed until you power the engine up, and then it's spraying fuel all over your engine compartment at 50 pounds per square inch. Common reason for a car fire. So you want to replace that line if you're going in there. I've already done it on this car because I had this thing apart several weeks ago when I replaced the heads on it, put it back together, and for some reason this fault with the #1 cylinder and the fuel injector popped up. Also helpful is a service manual, and what I like to do with the service manual is summarize what all the torque settings are going to be for the various components that I'm going to be taking apart, so that when I put them back together I don't have to go thumbing through the manual for each little thing. I've got it already summarized on a piece of paper here. I chose to put it in a plastic sleeve so that if it gets oil or grease on it, it won't come apart. The most important tool, I think, for doing something like this, where you're going to be taking apart dozens of electrical connections and vacuum lines, and they all fit together in an intricate manner, almost like building a ship inside of a bottle. You need, in my estimation, a digital camera with plenty of room on it so that you can record step by step everything you took apart, both before you took it apart, so you can memorialize its orientation within the engine compartment and its orientation as to other lines and other pieces of equipment in there, so that you can put it back together correctly, because you are not going to remember all this stuff. It's too much of a snake pit inside that engine compartment. Over here we have a very interesting device that is very necessary and very effective. It is a quick disconnect tool for various size fuel injection lines, and this makes taking apart, you absolutely need this in order to take apart some fuel injection lines that have a quick disconnect connection on one end of it, typically the end that is closest to the gas tank or fuel pump, and it only costs a couple of bucks, maybe $5 for the set, and you're going to need that. I also think that you need some paper, and here I've got it on a clipboard with a pen so you can take notes as to the chronology of how you took the car apart. Also invaluable, here are small sandwich bags. You use these sandwich bags along with a marker, and with the marker to basically catalog and organize everything. So you label the bolts that are common to each other, you put them inside of a bag, and you write on that bag what that bolt goes to and where it is within the engine. Also tape. This is painter's masking tape, and you absolutely need this to label both ends of connections that you take apart. So you could either label where they are, such as top side of the air intake, vacuum line, or I think a system I'm going to use this time is just A through Z. And so when I take apart two connections, the first ones that I take apart, I'm going to label the male end as an A and the female end as an A. Therefore, I know that both of those A's go back together. And then when I take apart the next connection, I'll label those two female and male parts of that connection B, so that I know that the two B's go together. Here's the fuel injector that we're going to replace, or the new one. It cost about $32, and you'll see here that it has O-rings on either end of the fuel injector. This is the part that goes into the intake manifold. It has a little hole on the end, and it squirts the fuel at about 50 to 60 pounds per square inch into the intake manifold. This is the supply end that connects into the fuel rail. Both of these O-rings are critical. They have to be in good shape. So it's a good idea to replace both of these whenever you take a fuel injector out, even if you're not replacing the fuel injector. And then you'll see the two little electrical connections that connect to the wiring harness that goes to the control module that fires the fuel injectors. Here's some gasket sets. Primarily I'm just concerned with the O-rings for the fuel injectors, and here is the gasket that goes between the intake manifold and the upper air plenum that's going to have to come off in order for me to access those rear fuel injectors. Over here, you'll see that I have a air compressor, and that's invaluable for two reasons. It's a little portable air compressor, and I found it works a lot better for me than trying to use the big one and stretch a hose from the big one in my garage. So this air compressor, I use it for blowing things off, cleaning out dust and grime and grit from parts that I've taken apart. So I'll put an air hose sprayer on the end of it, the business end. But also, I think it's very helpful to have what's called an air ratchet. This air ratchet is powered by air, and it will take off. You can connect it with your sockets over there and your extensions, and take apart bolts very quickly, as opposed to just with a regular ratchet. You're going to have to wind it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This, you just press the little button here and sorry about that. The air compressor cycled back on when the pressure went down, but it's full up now. And so I find that to be a very useful device in disassembling things and also reassembling things. It really cuts down on the amount of ratchet time that you blow taking something apart and putting it back together. Okay, here's the Chrysler with its hood up and the engine bay. And there's the 3.8 liter engine, and basically you can see the 2, 4, and 6 number fuel injectors. So there's the top of number 2, there's the top of number 4, and there's the top of number 6, and the wiring harness that attaches to them. And that wiring harness also connects to the back bank of fuel injectors, which unfortunately are completely inaccessible. And the one that is gone bad that I need to get to is the number 1 fuel injector, and that's back here behind this intake plenum. And so this intake plenum has to come off, and so does most everything around it. So the air box will have to come off, the air intake will have to come off, all of these vacuum lines and accelerator cables will have to come off. They have to be labeled, as I said, and we'll have to take off the ignition coil here. I'm not sure about the spark plug lines. We might be able to leave those off. Also, another problem is this alternator, which mounts with this bracket to the intake plenum, and that's going to be essentially in the way. So we're probably going to take that alternator out. That's going to necessitate taking out the serpentine belt. That can only be done with a serpentine removal tool. which is a little bit of an expensive tool. It might cost 50 bucks, but it is invaluable. It's necessary to make it super easy to get out that serpentine belt, which you otherwise probably would never be able to get out on your own, and you certainly would not be able to put it back in. It just is impossible to do because you've got to rotate this pulley down here that puts, it's a tensioner pulley, and there's not enough room to get a ratchet on there to bend it down enough, because it's got a spring on it, to release the tension enough on that serpentine belt to get it out. I was talking about that fuel injection line. Here it is. This is your fuel injection line. It connects to the fuel rail here. You can see I've used that high pressure type of hose clamp on it. And down here is the quick disconnect fitting that I would use with that special tool to get it off. One thing, you've got to release the pressure on the fuel injection line before you take it off, because you don't want fuel squirting all over the place or in your face. So in order to take this plenum off, you can see with the transverse mounted engine, half of the engine is back essentially underneath the windshield wiper cowl, and so we're going to have to take this windshield wiper cowl out. And it's actually a very easy thing to do. It essentially contains the windshield wiper motors and some of the apparatus for the windshield sprayers. But Chrysler, they didn't engineer a lot of things correctly, but that is one thing they did engineer. It comes out very quickly, gives you a lot more room to work on that, getting out that intake plenum. It may be feasible to do it without taking out the windshield wiper cowl, but it is just not worth it. It only takes 5 to 10 minutes to get the windshield wiper cowl out. Okay, back talking about the removal of the windshield wiper cowl. The first thing that has to happen is the two windshield wipers have to come off, and that's pretty easy. All you do is you flip up this little cover, and then you undo this bolt with a socket, and then just lift the windshield wipers off of their pivots. Over here you may be able to see a little bit more clearly what that bolt looks like. The cover here is broken, so it's going to be easier access. Okay, when taking off the windshield wiper cowling, you first have to take off the wipers, which you can see that I've done by taking off these 15mm bolts and then taking the wipers off of their pivots. And I've stored them in the back of the van. The next thing that has to happen to get off the wiper cowling is we've got to take off this top sort of grill. And the first step is taking off those wipers with the 15mm retaining bolts. There's the other pivot over there. And then next we've got to take out the Torx screws. I guess, yes, there's Torx screws. So there's Torx screws here, and there's one there. That's 2. There's one there, that's 3. There's one there, that's 4. There's one there, that's 5. And then the last one over here, there are 6 Torx screws that are going to have to come out. And I think it's going to be best to do this with the hood down. So we'll stop for a minute and readjust. Okay, we're going to be removing the grill. I've taken out all, or at least I've loosened all of the Torx screws. There you can see in the magnetic parts tray, the 2 bolts and the little 3 of the little Torx screws. And we're going to undo one more over here. And I was talking about critical tools that I think will make your life easier. And one that I forgot to mention that I think is also critical is a telescoping magnet to retrieve bolts. So you can see this bolt is kind of down here in between these little vanes. Difficult for me to get my fingers in there to grab it, but this is a telescoping magnet. It'll expand if you want to go way down in the deep recesses of the engine compartment for a lost bolt, and you can just put it on there and grab that bolt. Put it in your magnetic tray. A couple other bolts in here that are difficult for me to get out. And so I'm going to try and use the magnet to get at them. The magnet isn't really even getting close enough to get those, so I'm going to pry them out with a screwdriver. And it just doesn't want to come out. Okay, that one may be close enough. Got that one. Okay, this is probably going to just come out with a, the screw will come out with the whole grill assembly there. Okay, one thing that I didn't mention is that there are 4 little bolt type retainers, at least they serve the purpose of a bolt, that have to come off in order to get this grill off. And they are right here, right here, right here, and right here, and they are the width of a 16 millimeter socket, and so the 16 millimeter socket will fit right on that thing and hopefully screw it off. And there's an example of what it looks like. So you can see it's not a bolt, but it serves it's a retainer that serves the purpose of a bolt. Okay, there's the windshield wiper cowling with its grill off, and you can see all of the parts for that grill are sitting in my magnetic tray. And now I've labeled a plastic bag with the words wiper grill, and I'm going to put all those parts in there so they don't get lost and so that I know where exactly they go. And there's my bag with all of the wiper grill parts. Incidentally, before I took off that wiper grill, I had to disconnect the windshield washer hose, which was attached to the underside of the nozzle connections. That was no big deal. And so now the only thing keeping this cowling assembly, which you can see all the windshield motor apparatus in there, the only thing keeping that from coming out now are these 4 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4. They're 10 millimeter bolts. Once we get those out, then I expect that whole cowling assembly is going to come out very easily. The only thing that we have to do in order to make it come out all the way is we've got to disconnect this connector that comes from the wiring harness to the wiper motors. So that has to be disconnected. We've got to press this orange thing down to unlock it and then separate these 2 parts. The other things that we have to do is there's 2 drain hoses. They're kind of difficult to see, but here's one that has to be disconnected from the bottom of the assembly before we can pull it out. Over here, the windshield wiper hose has to be disconnected right there, and then the other drain right here has to be disconnected, and with those 4 bolts it should come right out. Okay, I spoke too soon on the windshield wiper cowling, the extent of the bolts. I've taken off the 1, 2, 3, 4 upper bolts, but now I'm realizing and remembering that there are 6 lower bolts. They are 13 millimeter bolts. One's there, 2 are here, 1's down in there, and 1 is over here. So we're going to have to take those off with a 13 millimeter socket and a 6-inch extension, and then we'll be home free. Okay, I've now removed the windshield wiper cowling assembly, and there it is out of the car. And here you can see the wiper assembly was sitting right here, and now I've got a whole lot more room to work back here and try and get out this intake plenum before I get to the fuel injection underneath it. And you can see over here we have a lot more room to access the alternator connection brackets and to get that free and clear. And also more room to work over here on this side where the air meter is for the air intake and all the attendant vacuum lines, electrical connections, and all of that. All this stuff we're going to have to label with that masking tape and make sure we record meticulously how things came apart and went back together so that we can reassemble. Okay, I'm now going to start getting into disconnecting things, which is going to involve electrical stuff and also at the end the fuel line. And so one of the things you want to make sure before you ever start working on things like that is to disconnect the battery. And so I'm going to take off the positive ground here, or the positive and the negative ground. Okay, the next item that we're going to take out after we've disconnected the battery cables is going to be the air box. This is essentially a air and water separator. It is upline from the air filter, which the air filter is down here. And so in order to take out this air box, we had to take out 2 10 millimeter bolts. These bolts went here and here. Did that with an air ratchet. And then we've got to disconnect the tube that goes from the air box to the throttle body here. And all we have to do is disconnect this or loosen this hose clamp here. We don't have to disconnect or loosen the hose clamp at this end near the air box. And the other thing we have to do is disconnect a hose clamp that is down here that connects the air box to lower tube to the air filter box. So I've loosened all of those. We also want to take off this this valve cover vent, and this thing will come off at the bottom first like that. Let me see the air filter exhaust there that goes into the air box, and then we just twist this guy off, and we have the air box out of the car, and now we can get at all that throttle body stuff.